In this presentation, I'll be connecting the newly released dietary guidelines to sports nutrition topics that we'll be covering in this course. Okay, quick question to start us off. When you hear dietary guidelines for Americans, how many of you immediately think this applies to athletes? Well, it might make sense that it would apply to athletes because the dietary guidelines are written for the general population, but they're not actually specifically written for athletes. But here's the key idea for today. Athletes don't ignore the guidelines, they build on them. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this lecture. The dietary guidelines for Americans are updated every 5 years and influence everything from school lunches to food labels to what your doctor might recommend. The new 2025 to 2030 guidelines put a strong emphasis on eating real, minimally processed foods, adequate protein intake, consuming less added sugar, choosing high quality foods over food marketing. So while these guidelines aren't written for athletes, they absolutely shape the food environment athletes live in. The guidelines are designed to reduce chronic disease risk and support long-term health. So sports nutrition adds another layer on this. Think about performance, recovery, training adaptation, injury prevention. The dietary guidelines give us a foundation for our diet. Sports nutrition builds the customized performance plan on top of that. One big headline from the new guidelines is an increased focus on protein. For the average person, that means making sure protein needs are met through real foods. For athletes, however, protein needs depend on several different factors, including training intensity, frequency, the type of sport or activity, recovery demands, and two athletes can eat the same foods and still need very different amounts. This is where individualization really matters. Next up, carbohydrates. Carbohydrates still play a major role in the dietary guidelines, and for athletes, they're a non-negotiable. Carbs are fuel. They fuel high intensity training, endurance performances, brain function during competition. And who wouldn't argue that all of those are important factors? The difference for athletes is looking at timing and quantity. What works for a sedentary adult won't fuel a 2-hour practice. So we need to make adjustments based on these different factors. Next up is fats. The new guidelines emphasize eating real, minimally processed foods, which is actually great news for athletes because healthy fats support hormone production, joint health, long-term energy, inflammation reduction. So this isn't about low-fat or high-fat diets. It's about choosing the right fats and using them strategically, which as we cover each of the nutrients in our course, you'll learn more about this. Added sugar, okay? Added sugar is a carbohydrate. The guidelines recommend reducing added sugar, and that's good advice for general health. Notice it says reduce and not eliminate. But here's where sports nutrition gets nuanced. Added sugars during exercise can improve performance. Added sugars outside of training all day long might not be so helpful, but it can serve our recovery as well. Same nutrient, different context. That's a theme you'll see again and again in sports nutrition. Now up, hydration and sodium or electrolytes. For the general population, sodium reduction is often recommended. For athletes, Sweat changes the rules. Long, intense, or hot training sessions may require more fluids, more sodium, or other electrolytes, and individual adjustments need to be made. Once again, the guidelines give us a baseline, training tells us how to modify it. And there's tools out there to help us. The nutrition facts label are built around the dietary guidelines. Athletes can use labels to calculate total calories in a package, compare protein serving, evaluate micronutrients like iron and calcium. The key, though, really for anybody, is knowing how to interpret those numbers for your training demands or nutrient goals, not just whether a food looks healthy. That single food needs to be looked at or considered within the context of an individual's total diet. And we don't want to leave out supplements, okay? And supplements fit nicely with also making evidence-based decisions, okay? The guidelines emphasize food first, and for good reason. Supplements are regulated as foods, not drugs. They don't have to prove effectiveness before being sold, which can easily lead to overconsumption, especially when they're stacked on top of one another. Athletes need to evaluate claims critically and compare supplement intakes to DRIs and the upper limits, and really not fall into listening to misinformation. So it all comes back to this concept of individualization. When creating a sports nutrition plan, we have lots of things to consider: sport type or activity type, training intensity and duration, frequency, goals, recovery needs, and of course, overall lifestyle. The dietary guidelines help set the stage, but the athlete writes the script. So the final key takeaways are that the dietary guidelines are not the enemy of sports nutrition, right? They are a starting point, and a solid starting point. Performance comes from individualization, context, and evidence-based choices. If you understand the guidelines, you're much better equipped to build a smart, effective sports nutrition plan.